Welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webcast. We're so glad you were able to join us today and hope that you will really enjoy our presentation. My name is Lauren Cornick-Dollar, and as a native Texan, I'm really excited to hear from our guest presenter today. His name is Michael Ritchie, and he is an assistant historian with the Texas State Guard. He is currently working on a book right now about the Texas State Guard in World War II. Michael, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for having me here. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael Ritchie, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to begin by extending my sincere thanks to the team at the National Museum of the Pacific War for inviting me to speak on this topic. Today, I'll be sharing the story of the Texas Defense Guard, an often overlooked chapter of World War II history that highlights the men who served right here at home to protect Texas while our National Guard was deployed overseas. Before I begin, I'd like to share a little background about myself. Unlike many of the speakers you probably hear from, I'm not an academic by trade. I currently serve as a senior financial analyst for the Texas Military Department at Camp Mabry. My passion for history started at a young age, inspired by my grandfather and his endless collection of World War II documentaries. Over the years, that curiosity has turned into a lifelong interest, and thanks to a few fortunate opportunities, a meaningful part of my life. I now serve on the board of the Texas Military Forces Museum Foundation, and I'm also a historian with the Texas State Guard, being able to retain that position after my discharge from the Guard as a first lieutenant. The current Texas State Guard, of course, is the direct successor to the organization that we will be discussing today, the Texas Defense Guard. Before we can understand the story of the Defense Guard, first we need to look at the role of the National Guard within the United States military structure. The National Guard, as we know it today, was formally established in 1903 with the passage of the Militia Act, more commonly known as the Dick Act, named after Senator Charles Dick, its sponsor. This legislation unified the many independent state militias that had existed since the founding of the Republic. Before 1903, each state maintained its own militia, often organized, trained, and equipped to very different standards. This inconsistency caused many problems when those units were called into national service. The Militia Act of 1903 changed that by standardizing organization, training, and equipment across all state forces by guaranteeing federal funding to any state that complied with these new standards. In effect, the Dick Act transformed America's patchwork of local militias into a single cohesive institution, the National Guard. Further revisions in the National Defense Acts of 1916, 1920, and 1933 continued to redefine the Guard's role. The 1916 Act, in particular, established the National Guard as the only organized state militia, effectively prohibiting every state from forming their own separate guards. This legal restriction would later become a major challenge when the need for state-controlled forces reemerged on the eve of World War II. Now, when most people think of the National Guard, they picture it as a backup of the U.S. Army, called into action during national emergencies or foreign wars. And while that's true, the Guard's role at home is just as equally vital. Beyond their federal duties, Guardsmen serve as the military arm of their state government. They are the only ones you see when responding to natural disasters, flying helicopters to fight wildfires, rescuing families from floodwaters, or distributing supplies after tornadoes. They are also the troops deployed by governors to restore order during times of civil unrest. In short, the National Guard stands at the intersection of state and federal service, ready to defend the nation abroad and to protect communities at home. Before diving into the details, let's have an overview of the Texas Defense Guard, the organization that would later evolve into today's Texas State Guard. The Defense Guard was officially established in 1941, though its formation began a year earlier, in 1940, as global tensions were rapidly escalating. When President Franklin Delano Roosevelt federalized the Texas National Guard in 1940, Texas and every other state suddenly found itself without any state-controlled military force. That meant that there was no organized body available to respond to natural disasters, civil unrest, or the growing fear of internal sabotage by so-called fifth columnists, agents of foreign powers believed to be operating within the United States. Now, with the benefit of 85 years of hindsight, the idea of widespread sabotage or invasion of American soil might seem far-fetched, but in 1940, the threat felt very real. Across the Atlantic, the world had already watched the Nazi war machine roll across Europe, toppling nation after nation. At the same time, in the Pacific, the Japanese Empire had conquered Korea, Manchuria, northern Indochina, and nearly all of eastern China. The story of what would eventually become the Texas Defense Guard begins in the summer of 1940 in the quiet fields of Refugio County. As radio broadcasts carried grim reports of Nazi invasion sweeping across Europe, one Texan, the noted historian Hobart Husson, began to wonder how his own community could prepare if war came closer to home. From that concern came an idea to organize a local home guard, a volunteer force ready to defend their county and their state if needed. Husson gathered a small group of civic leaders, including local businessman Alan Driscoll Rook and members of the American Legion, and together they built something remarkable. In a matter of weeks, they had enlisted more than 900 men, forming one of the first organized home defense groups in the nation. Because Refugio County had deep Irish roots, settled generations earlier by Irish immigrants, the men chose to call themselves the Royal Irish Regiment. With no state funding or official equipment, they trained wherever they could. They drilled on football fields and open pastures, often using wooden rifles if they had them, and when night fell, they lit the training grounds with the headlights of their cars. Their leader, Alan Rook, was a respected World War I veteran. He was chosen by the men to serve as their commanding officer and given the honorary rank of colonel. At the time, newspapers proudly reported that the Royal Irish Regiment of Refugio County was the first home guard company organized anywhere in the United States, a testament to the courage, patriotism, and initiative that ordinary Texans prepared for in extraordinary times. While Colonel Husson was working with the Royal Irish Regiment, efforts were also underway in Austin to prepare Texas for what was coming. The state's Adjutant General, J. Watt Page, knew that war was on the horizon, and that once the Texas National Guard was federalized, Texas would be left without a military force under state control. Since the passage of the National Defense Act in 1916, it had been illegal for states to organize their own militias. But by the summer of 1940, the threat of war and the reality of the Guard's impending federalization had already led citizens across Texas to begin forming informal home defense groups. General Page saw both the need and the opportunity. Enlisting the help of Austin attorney William J. Lawson, a man who would later serve as Texas Secretary of State, he drafted legislation that would change federal law. Their goal was simple but urgent: to allow states to form state defense forces whenever their National Guards were called into federal service. At the same time, President FDR and the War Department were having very similar discussions in Washington about how these state guards might operate and coordinate with federal authorities. Recognizing the moment, Lawson personally flew to Washington, D.C. and hand-delivered his draft bill to Senator Morris Shepherd. Senator Shepherd, and Texan as well, introduced the bill, shepherded it through Congress, and on October 21, 1940, it was signed into law by the president. Even as this political process unfolded, General Page was already preparing on the home front. As early as September of 1940, he began pre-authorizing home guard companies across Texas, even though he technically had no legal authority to maintain a militia. To stay within the law, he instructed that these companies drill without weapons, often using those wooden rifles in place of real ones. This clever workaround kept the movement within the legal limits, but it also meant that when the new federal law passed, Texas would already have a trained and organized system ready to mobilize immediately. It was a bold and strategic move, demonstrating both Page's foresight and his spirit that would become to define the Texas Defense Guard. Even though Congress had amended the National Defense Act in October of 1940, Texas law still did not permit it. That would soon change, but only with action from the state legislature. When the 47th Texas legislative session convened in January of 1941, Governor WWII Daniel moved very quickly. On January 21st, he submitted House Bill 45, known as the Texas Defense Guard Act, to formally authorize and organize a state military force under Texas law. The legislature wasted no time. The bill passed the House on January 29th, cleared the Senate on February 5th, and became effective on February 10th. In just 15 days, the state of Texas had introduced, debated, and enacted legislation that created an entirely new military organization, a state army to defend the home front. It was a swift and decisive response to the uncertainty of the world at war, and a testament to the determination to protect its people and its sovereignty. Thanks to the leadership of General Page and his dedicated staff, the Texas Defense Guard was able to organize with impressive speed. Before the Texas Defense Guard Act had even passed, Page's headquarters had already pre-approved 193 companies across the state, grouped into 48 battalions. The months that followed were a flurry of activity. Official inspectors from the Adjutant General's Department traveled across Texas to formally review and bring these units into state service. Although only 5 inspectors were on the department's paid staff, the real progress came from the tireless work of unpaid Guard officers who volunteered their time to conduct inspections. They followed standards and procedures published by General Page's office, ensuring that each company met the same level of organization and readiness. By the end of 1941, the Guard had expanded to 51 battalions, representing every corner of the state. While most of these were infantry units, the organization also boasted something unique: the largest state-run air force in the country, with 15 squadrons comprising 45 individual flights. These aviation units were composed largely of private pilots who used their own aircraft to patrol Texas's coastline and key strategic sites, keeping watch for potential Axis activity. The aviation branch not only provided valuable reconnaissance, but also served as an inspiration for the creation of the Civil Air Patrol. In fact, its success led to a brief dispute between the state and federal government in 1942, before the Guard's aviation units were reluctantly integrated into the Civil Air program. The Guard's innovation did not stop there. Through the efforts of Donald Taft, a Houstonian with remarkable initiative, the Guard was able to establish a Marine battalion trained for water-based operations along the Gulf Coast. This unit went on to serve honorably in several of the Guard's major wartime deployments, further demonstrating the versatility that defined the Texas Guard during the war. Using records at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, it's about 80 boxes that are down at the archives, we were able to reconstruct a map of Texas that shows where all of the 51 battalions ended up being. And as you can see, they covered the entire state. What's notable is in large population centers like Houston or DFW, one battalion might make up just one county, whereas in other remote areas of the state, battalions like the 14th and the 34th would make up large sections of the area simply because of the lack of population. In the early days of the Texas Defense Guard, recruiting efforts focused heavily on patriotic organizations. Groups like the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, and other deeply rooted civil groups. That was no coincidence. The Texas Defense Guard Act actually required each company to have a sponsoring organization, and these veteran-led groups stepped forward eagerly. Because many of these organizations were made up of World War I veterans or older citizens, the first wave of Texas Defense Guard recruits tended to be older than their National Guard counterparts. The Guard actively sought out veterans of the Great War, knowing that these men could also provide discipline, leadership, and experience. Normally, non-commissioned officers, otherwise known as NCOs, would train new recruits. But since nearly all of those NCOs had already been federalized with the National Guard, the Defense Guard had to rely on these older veterans to fill that critical training role. The results were quite impressive. A late war survey found that more than 40% of the officer corps of the Guard had been veterans of the First World War, men who brought a steady hand and a deep sense of duty to the younger generation. Over time, though, the average age of the Defense Guard members began to drop. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Guard saw a huge surge of younger recruits. These men were men that couldn't serve in the federal military either because of physical limitations or because they worked in critical war industries. In 1942, the Guard even lowered the minimum enlistment age from 18 to 16, allowing teenagers to begin military training early. Many of those young men would go on to join the armed forces at 17 or be drafted at 18, entering service already trained and confident, and often rising quickly through the enlisted ranks. Some of them, after suffering injuries or being discharged, returned to the Defense Guard, continuing to serve their communities on the home front. Now, we're all familiar with the National Guard's motto of citizen soldiers, but the Texas Defense Guard may have embodied that phrase more fully than any other organization in our history. Its members came from every walk of life: lawyers, farmers, school teachers, shopkeepers, and students. With less restrictive physical requirements, it welcomed Texas who might never have been eligible for federal service, yet who were still determined to serve in any way they could. In the truest sense, the Texas Defense Guard represented the heart of Texas, citizens standing together, ready to protect their communities, their state, and their country. And some of the pictures I have up here came from some maneuvers up in Fort Worth. We've got what we would classify as a World War I veteran and one of the older generation that joined. Mess Sergeant Arley, right here on the right-hand side. He became a chef, and everyone loved what he cooked. And he drove around this trailer right here to all of the units' things, and he would cook meals out of the back of his trailer for the guys. On the left side here, we have Sergeant Ed Meyerson and Private Robert Dunn. Especially with Robert Dunn, you can see that this guy was 17 at this time. They were very young, but when they would go and do guard trainings, they were gaining valuable skills that would eventually help them significantly when they entered the federal service. While they couldn't participate in mock battles with real explosives, I wanted to point out right here, in their hands, it looks like a potato bag, and that's actually what it is. So they would take potatoes and wrap them in these bags, and then they would fill them with flour. And so when they were having mock battles, they would throw these at each other. And then if you got flour on your uniform, you were considered to be a KIA. When the Texas National Guard was federalized in 1940, it counted roughly 11,000 officers and men among its ranks. You might expect that the home guard left behind would be smaller, a modest local force to fill in the gap during war. But that wasn't the case in Texas. By the end of 1941, the newly formed Defense Guard had already grown to more than 15,000 men under arms, and that number kept climbing. Over the next 2 years, enlistments continued to rise until the Guard reached a wartime peak of 18,000 in the later part of 1943. According to War Department records from early 42, only one state, California, had a larger defense force, exceeding Texas by about 1,000 men. But when you compare those numbers to each state's population, the story changes a little bit. With a 1940 population of about 6.4 million compared to California's population of 7 million, Texas had by far the largest state guard per capita in the nation. And here's an interesting twist to that story. Of the roughly 20 state defense forces that still exist today, Texas once again leads the way. The modern state guard, according to publicly available data, remains the largest in the country, with a force of about 1,800 members, continuing that proud tradition of service. The creation of an entirely new army in Texas brought with it a number of unique challenges. In 1940, there was no dedicated funding and no access to federal resources, which meant that training depended almost entirely on the knowledge and experience of veterans from the First World War. When the federal government formally authorized state defense forces later that same year, new resources slowly became available. Initially, these came in the form of field manuals and training guides already in use by federal troops. The War Department distributed recommended training schedules and corresponding manuals to all state guards. If followed, they provided about 60 hours of structured instruction, giving new Guard members a significant advantage when they later transitioned into federal service. Throughout the war, the federal government avoided publishing official state guard manuals, partly because they feared that they were going to be left with a large and unwanted stockpile at the end of the war. In that absence, privately published guides filled the gap. One of the most popular was the State Defense Force Handbook, first printed in 1941. But Texas, as always, chose to go its own way. Recognizing the need for training tailored to the specific mission of the Texas Defense Guard, the AG's office commissioned the creation of a state-specific handbook. Completed in 1944, it was developed entirely in-house by Major Don Peacock and his staff at the Peacock Military Academy in San Antonio. Although it was never widely distributed, this Texas-produced manual represented a great achievement, a fully homegrown training system built from the ground up. It was even adopted by several states that bordered Texas. I've got a couple pictures here. So a lot of people will recognize the field manual on the right. They still have pretty much the same look as today, and they're used by the federal service. And then on the left here is the front cover of the State Guard Officer's Reference Book. This was developed entirely in-house by Texas, and it was widely adopted. And regardless of how widely adopted it was, it's turned out to be quite a rarity. As of now, there's only 2 copies that are known to exist, and one of them is still in State Guard possession. while the other is at the Texas Military Forces Museum Archive down at Camp Mabry. A couple of pictures here that I wanted to show. So these were taken in San Augustine. They are members of the 44th Battalion. And as I stated earlier, they trained wherever they could. At the time, the Federal Armory system that everyone recognizes today when you drive down the highway and see a National Guard armory, that did not exist in the 40s. Most of those buildings wouldn't begin to be constructed until the 1950s. So in this case, they actually are drilling in the high school auditorium. And in the leftmost picture, you can actually see the basketball goal behind them. And looking at kind of a cross section of the people are here, you can see on the left side and on the right side, you've got some people that we would consider to be old timers when it came to military service. More than likely, they had been veterans of the First World War. But then in the middle, you'll see some of these individuals, and they look very young. And the reason they look young is because they're all high school kids. And you can't see it very well, but there's a patch on this guy's shirt right here. And when looking at the Library of Congress archive where some of these came from, you can zoom in on it very well. And that's actually a high school ROTC patch. So what the Guard did is when it went to these schools and used their facilities, it incorporated itself with the ROTC groups. And all of the members that were in high school ROTC would end up being pulled in to be members of the Texas Defense Guard. Here's a couple more pictures, courtesy of the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Down here on the right, the Guard, just as today, one of its biggest things is it has to market itself to bring in new people. A lot of people don't know a whole lot about it. And so what the Guard did during World War II is it would go to kind of community events and it would do drill and ceremony presentations. They would participate in parades. And the idea was that if people saw them, they would want to be part of that. And still kind of the case today. So we've got members on the right down here. They're actually at the Fair Park in Dallas. I don't know if this was a state fair or not, but it was some sort of community event there. And they were practicing all of their drill and ceremony. On the top left here, we actually have something pretty interesting, and it's very, very little known is about it. Hopefully, we'll be able to bring more of that to the forefront in the future. But this is a group called the S Women's Corps. It was 44 women that created this group 3 days after Pearl Harbor. All of them were employees at the Department of Public Safety. And they became one of the first women's groups that were kind of auxiliaries of the Texas Defense Guard. But what's interesting about them is all of this predated the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. That wouldn't come in until 1942. And there'd be hot debates on that in Washington, D.C. So in a way, Texas was kind of progressive with this, instilling and bringing in women to be part of Defense Guard operations and train under Defense Guard personnel before even the federal government brought them in. In addition to maintaining written records and an administrative readiness, the Texas Defense Guard placed strong emphasis on weapons proficiency and field training. In mid-1941, the War Department distributed surplus M1917 rifles. These were leftovers from World War I, and they were given to state defense forces across the country. Texas received an allocation of 5,205 rifles, enough to equip only about half of its pre-war National Guard. Although appreciated, these rifles were often in very poor condition, and because of the newly deformed Defense Guard was larger than the National Guard, only about 1 in 3 soldiers received a weapon. The remainder had to scrounge, purchase, or borrow arms for training. By 1942, the War Department did an about-face and recalled these 1917 rifles to replace them with an assorted plethora of shotguns. A few fortunate guardsmen received pump-action riot guns used by prisons, but most relied on double-barrel hunting shotguns, a far cry from standard military arm. Despite these limitations, the Guard focused on mastering the latest riot control and civil disturbance tactics developed by U.S. Army military police units. This training paid off during the 1943 Beaumont race riots when more than 1,800 members of the Guard were mobilized to help restore order. Through weekly drills and monthly field exercises, Guardsmen continued to refine their skills, transforming from a hastily organized state force into a disciplined and capable unit ready to meet the challenges of wartime service on the home front. In this picture, we'll see more of it in the future, but this is some training down at Camp Bullis, which is just north of San Antonio. You see some of these old timers here. They look kind of funny. This is not what you'd expect during a normal riot service, but needless to say, they train for riots. This was a big thing because civil and internal security was a big focus on the National Guard on the home front, and therefore a big part of the Defense Guard on the home front. Down here, you can see one of the rifles that was received from the federal government. I have no idea where this was taken, but it is inside of a building where they practice some of their marksmanship training, and they would show how to aim rifles, how to load them, how to disassemble and clean them. By 1942, the Defense Guard had grown into the professional organization that the U.S. Army originally envisioned. Collaboration between the two forces strengthened considerably during this period. To improve coordination across the country, the Army had been divided in the United States into regional service commands, each responsible for overseeing military training and logistics within its geographic area. Texas fell under the 8th Service Command, headquartered in Dallas and led by Major General Richard Donovan. General Donovan was a man of quite a bit of foresight and immediately recognized the value of a strong and capable Texas Defense Guard. Although the War Department required cooperation between state guards and their respective service commands, the relationship he developed with the Texas Guard went far beyond minimum expectations. It became a genuine partnership over the years. Under his leadership, the 8th Service Command dispatched Army liaisons to work directly at Texas Defense Guard headquarters in Camp Mabry. Together, they developed a series of joint training programs, most notably the annual summer exercises held at Camp Bullis near San Antonio. These courses were designed for both officers and non-commissioned officers of the Defense Guard and were taught directly by U.S. Army instructors. Training covered a wide range of military skills, from the use of automatic weapons and armored vehicles to chemical warfare and tactics for handling domestic emergencies or potential enemy incursions. The program ran successfully in 1942, 43, and 44, and was so effective that by 45, it had expanded into a traveling format. Instead of bringing every battalion to one location, Army instructors took training across the state, ensuring that every unit benefited from standardized instruction and the same level of readiness. Here's some of those pictures that came from Camp Bullis. When people think of the home front, they don't necessarily think of state guards being a force to repel invasion. However, members of the Texas Defense Guard certainly felt that they could do that if they were called to do so, and therefore their training reflected this. So on the left here, they're actually working with a .30 caliber machine gun. They're learning how to use it, reload it, clean it. Hopefully they would never have to use it, but they were capable nonetheless. On the right, it's a little bit more interesting. So the Defense Guard, never being an army considered, say, if the Axis came in through Galveston fighting them off, their goal was to become guerrillas on the home front, to slow down an enemy army's advance. And doing so, they would have to kind of improvise a lot on the fly, as there wouldn't be supply chains for arms and weapons. So here, the Army actually trained them on how to make homemade grenades. So they would take a bunch of nails, put them in a tin can, fill it with gunpowder, and then call it good. I definitely don't think this would be something that would be taught today, but it was certainly something that was taught back then. Here's some more pictures from Camp Bullis. So we've got a big explosion here, and then this is the aftermath of that explosion. So in regards to the grenades, they did that, but the idea was that if the army is invading, they also have vehicles that you're going to have to take out. So if an army can't move, it can't go anywhere, and it's going to be a lot less successful. So what the Army did is they would teach the Defense Guard people how to make these improvised explosive devices. And so they'd get, oil barrels or feed barrels, and then they'd fill them with explosives. And then the idea was you'd bury them in roads, or you'd put them under a bridge in a culvert. And as the enemy drove over, you'd explode this, hopefully taking out the bridge and the vehicle at the same time. When the Texas Defense Guard was first established, it took its name directly from Governor WWII Daniels' original bill, which had created the organization in 41. For the first few years, this name served well and became widely recognized across the state. However, the War Department in Washington had consistently used a different term, referring to all similar organizations nationwide as state guards, to denote the difference in control from the National Guard. To bring Texas in line with that federal terminology, it was decided in 1943 that the Texas Defense Guard should officially change its name. On the recommendation of the Adjutant General, the Texas legislature formally adopted this change during its 1943 legislative session. From that point forward, the Texas Defense Guard became known as the Texas State Guard, a name it continues to carry to the present. This shield right here, that's what it's called, the State Guard shield, this is still the logo that's in use today. So this was the logo that was on my uniform when I was an officer in the Texas State Guard. Although the Texas Defense Guard was never required to take up arms against an Axis invasion, nevertheless, they were used to maintain law and order in both natural disasters and civil unrest several times during the war. Their first test came in June of 1941 when the city of Fort Worth experienced catastrophic flooding, specifically in the Brookside Acres neighborhood where the Trinity River overflowed its banks by 2 blocks. This resulted in the evacuation of the neighborhood until waters receded. On the night of the 19th, the Texas Defense Guard was mobilized to patrol the area and to prevent looting, redirecting traffic and keeping the neighborhood locked down. This would be one of, if not the very first time, that the Defense Guard was mobilized to aid civil authorities during a natural disaster. The second deployment happened in mid-September when a tropical storm slammed into the Gulf Coast just south of Galveston and hit the Houston area hard. On September 23rd, over 700 guardsmen from the 2nd, 7th, 22nd, and 48th Marine Battalions were activated with the sole mission of providing every conceivable type of aid to civil authorities, as the order stated. During the night of the storm, these guardsmen patrolled the streets of downtown Houston, braving 95-mile-an-hour winds to prevent looting, while also filling every police cruiser with additional troops to provide backup to the stretched-thin police departments. Additionally, they blocked major roads that had flooded, performed water rescues, and operated shelters in school gyms and other public buildings for citizens to ride out the storm in. When the storm subsided, the first airplanes to take off from a Houston airport in over 30 hours were pilots with the aviation branch who went aloft to look for survivors in the Kemah area that might be in need of water rescue. The largest deployment the Guard participated in was the Beaumont race riots of 1943. On June 15th, over 2,000 shipyard workers and 1,000 citizens rioted in Beaumont after an African American was accused of raping a white woman. Armed with guns, axes, and other tools, they began terrorizing the African American neighborhood of Beaumont. Many African Americans were assaulted and over 100 homes were looted. Beaumont Mayor George Gary made an urgent plea to the Adjutant General's Department, which swiftly mobilized the 18th Battalion of the Texas Defense Guard and other local units. Working alongside 100 state police and 75 Texas Rangers, over 1,800 members of the Guard turned the courthouse square into an armed camp and locked down the city. All public transit was halted and the city was put under martial law as the Guard restored order. Turning the Jefferson County Fairgrounds into a stockade, over 200 rioters were apprehended to face a military tribunal led by Colonel Sidney Mason. 29 rioters were eventually released to custody of local law enforcement on charges of assault, battery, and arson, while the rest were released due to lack of evidence. During this event, the Guard swiftly restored order and martial law was ended on June 20th. After World War II, the Texas Defense Guard, by then known as the Texas State Guard, was disbanded in August of 1947 when the National Guard returned home from federal service. However, the value of maintaining a trained, state-controlled force quickly became clear as we entered the era of the Cold War. In 1948, the state established the Texas State Guard Reserve Corps under Lieutenant General Claude V. Burkhead to preserve that capability. It remained active through the Cold War, stepping in during national emergencies such as the Berlin Crisis of 1961, when the Texas National Guard was again federalized. In 1965, the organization was officially reconstituted as the modern Texas State Guard, becoming one of the 3 components of today's Texas Military Department, alongside the Army and Air National Guard. Since then, the Guard's mission has broadened from wartime defense to include civil support, disaster relief, and homeland security operations. Members have assisted in hurricane evacuations, search and rescue missions, the ongoing Operation Lone Star at the Texas border, and pandemic responses, continuing the Guard's long legacy of Texans serving Texas. As we've seen today, the story of the Texas Defense Guard is one of determination, resourcefulness, and service. Formed in 1941 under the leadership of Governor O'Daniel and the Adjutant General J. Watt Page, the Guard filled a critical gap when the Texas National Guard was called into federal service. What began as a small volunteer force quickly grew into one of the largest and most organized state defense forces in the nation. Its members came from every corner of Texas: farmers, teachers, veterans, and businessmen, all united by a common goal: to protect their communities and ensure that the state remained secure during a time of global uncertainty. Through tireless effort, the Guard built structure and professionalism. From its 51 battalions and a unique state air wing to specialized units like the Marine Battalion out of Houston, the organization demonstrated both initiative and innovation. By 1942, the Guard had formed a strong partnership with the 8th Service Command of the U.S. Army. Joint trainings at Camp Bullis and Camp Mabry helped raise the Guard standards to a level rivaling federal troops, preparing them to respond to floods, riots, and coastal patrols throughout the war. In 1943, the Guard officially became the Texas State Guard, aligning its identity with the national terminology and cementing its role as the state's permanent military force. The Texas Defense Guard story is more than just a footnote in World War II history. It is a testament to the spirit of citizen soldiers who stepped forward when their state and nation needed them most. Their legacy lives on today in the men and women of the modern Texas State Guard, who continue to serve Texas with that same dedication and pride.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing the story of the Texas Defense Guard with us. As a native Texan, it's not a story that I was familiar with. I'm sure our at-home audience might have been surprised by some of the things you shared today about the Texas Defense Guard as well. Before I let you go, I have a couple questions for you. The first question is, were there any figures that you didn't have a chance to mention during your presentation, but served in the Texas Defense Guard and then, use those skills later on in life and maybe become notable or famous?
Yeah, there's a couple people. I mentioned Austin Attorney Lawson, who became the Texas Secretary of State. I mentioned Husson, who became a notable Texana collector and author in Texas. Some of the other ones was there's a guy out in Midland. He started as Major Knickerbocker, but in 1943, he was promoted to be the Adjutant General after General Page was removed from his position. He was notable as he is the only Adjutant General in Texas history that did not start out in the Texas National Guard, for example. So he retained his position until after the war. So after the war, when the Federal National Guard was back, you actually had a Defense Guard officer that was the ultimate supreme military commander in Texas. He's one of them. Another one that comes to mind is Lloyd Benson Sr. He was a major out in West Texas at the time, and his son, Lloyd Benson Jr., was a member of the Defense Guard under his dad. And Lloyd Benson ended up becoming the Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton in the 90s.
Next question I have for you is, in your research, have you found any evidence or anecdotal evidence of some of the younger guys who were in the Texas Defense Guard and then transitioned into active service, maybe talking about how the skills they learned were transferable and helped them?
Yes, there's quite a bit of evidence of that. I don't have any names to give you off the top of my head because there's so many letters, but down at the Texas State Archives where they have all the documents from the Defense Guard, there is a plethora of letters written by individuals that were in the Defense Guard and then were drafted into federal service. They'd graduate basic training and then they'd be promoted to sergeant instantly because of their training in the Guard. And they would write home talking about how great that was. There's a couple cases of people that were at Iwo Jima. They got wounded, they were medically discharged, and they came back to the Guard and they told stories about how the training of the Guard helped them get through basic and then, actual combat. And on top of that, there are tons of letters addressed to the tags. So it would be first General Page and then General Knickerbocker from various field commanders all over the world talking about how they could spot people that had been in the Texas Defense Guard simply because they knew what they were doing and they were well more trained than some of the other people there.
Thank you, Michael, again for sharing all of this amazing history with us. As a native Texan, it's not a story or a piece of history that I was familiar with, and I'm sure our at-home audience appreciates it just as much as I do. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and learned a little something new. The Texas Defense Guard is an inspiring example of responsible citizenship and leadership, and sharing the stories of men and women in uniform is part of our mission here at the National Museum of the Pacific War. If you have any questions about today's webcast, please email them to education@nimmitzfoundation.org. We'll see you next time.